Sedex is a not-for-profit global membership organisation which is dedicated to driving improvements in global supply chains. We're the largest collaborative platform for managing ethical supply chain data, and we have over 600 customer members, more than 30,000 suppliers around the world in 150 different countries and 25 different industry sectors. We cover 4 key sustainability pillars, from labour standards, health and safety, environment and business ethics, which for Sedex is focused on anti-corruption. And our mission is to drive collaboration, to reduce duplication, and to drive convergence in the approach to improving standards around the world. And also to help companies monitor and manage and identify issues in order to do that. Just giving you a flavour of some of our members include some of the largest retailers and brands around the world, all the way down to some of the smallest suppliers, farmers, growers in the world. So a real diverse range of organisations that we represent. As has already been said this morning, pressures on companies to monitor and understand their supply chains have never been greater. From new layers of legislation, from the Dodd-Frank Act, the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, the UK Bribery Act, accompanied by media and stakeholder pressure, companies are increasingly compelled to perform robust supply chain due diligence. And those supply chain risks can present themselves in a number of different ways, as we've already heard. And events such as the horse meat scandal and the Rana Plaza factory collapse have highlighted further not only the risks to company reputation and revenue, but also the vital role that companies have to play in protecting workers and the environment. There were some companies that when the horse meat scandal hit in February thought that they weren't affected because they knew who their first tier supplier was. And obviously that very quickly proved not to be the case because that wasn't where the issue lay. And similarly, after the Rana Plaza factory collapse, there was a rush of companies around the world trying to work out if they sourced from that factory. Because of complex international supply chains, unauthorized subcontracting, it took companies, or some companies, a significant amount of time to find out if they did or did not source from that factory, and many of them just didn't know. So, as we've said, supply chain risks can vary greatly from human rights risks. So, the Danish Institute for Human Rights saying that 2.3 million people die each year at work, so 6 Rana Plazas a day. Factory safety issues, climate change risks, corruption risks, where 1 in 5 member staff in European companies consider it acceptable to pay bribes. You can see that the supply chain risks vary greatly across a whole range. And at Sedex, we see our members working incredibly hard to ensure visibility through their supply chain using a variety of approaches. Some use Sedex to support a risk-based approach, to really understand where critical issues lie and prioritise their focus and resources, while others use the Sedex platform to enable in-depth assessment of first and or sub-tier suppliers. And many companies also directly engage with their workers on capability building projects to build partnerships and processes that are based on transparency and trust. So the truth of the matter is that risks increase the further down the supply chain you go, whilst at the same time the capacity to address those risks decreases. It's the iceberg of non-compliances lurking beneath the surface. And Sedex data shows that the number and criticality of non-compliances increases sharply beyond the first tier. So focusing just on the first tier is not enough. However, our research shows that companies around the world really aren't achieving visibility deep down their supply chain. Engaging with suppliers is vital, but it is difficult. We recognise that suppliers further down the supply chain are likely to have little or no relationship with the final customer, and therefore little understanding of the customer's requirements and expectations, and that's what Sedex tries to enable. In turn, the customer generally will have less commercial leverage over the supplier that are deeper down within their supply chain. And that's why approaching each supplier independently is not effective and causes duplication. So collaboration is key. Some of the supply chain issues that we see are chronic. No company can solve them on their own, and duplication is still prevalent. And therefore, if companies can work together to drive convergence, then more time and effort could be spent on addressing the issues rather than in the cycle of constant audits. So what I'd like to do, I know it's going to feel like a cinema now, I'd like to just show you a very short film.
If transparency isn't occurring in your supply chain, it fundamentally means that you really are in danger of not having a responsible sourcing programme.
Without that transparency, we've got no guarantee that the orders we put in are going to be fulfilled.
If there's no transparency in your supply chain, you wouldn't know what could go wrong. It makes it much more difficult to identify the quality of the product, and also to make sure that the product that you're actually serving the customer is what's labeled on the outside of it.
Transparency demonstrates tangibly you have nothing to hide, and I think that's something that will strengthen any commercial relationship.
And I think it's an important decision that boards need to take. They need to recognise that this isn't a threat to business, but this is actually about how to run a business better.
Because what companies do have is very good access to their own data. They know how many plants they've got. They know how many people they employ and what wages they pay them and the ages and qualifications. They know all of that. What they don't know is, well, what about our suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers? And that's where access to that information becomes essential, because without it, you can't answer those questions around the board table.
If you had a highly transparent supply chain, you'd be able to get a bit more insight into the risks at each of those different stages in the process. So you'd be able to understand what the risks are at source. You'd be able to understand what the violations or risks might be at a broker level. You'd understand also the kinds of risks that could then exist in the manufacturing part of that particular supply chain. So transparency in that case would have allowed you to see different types of risks at each of those three different stages in the supply chain.
One of those issues that I see going around the world is a fear about asking workers what they actually think, for fear that it might unleash something that is difficult to control, or asking suppliers what they think might unleash some difficult trading relationships.
And it's a difficult balance, because whilst the buyer wants transparency to be assured of the sources of the goods and services they're buying, often the supplier that you're buying from doesn't want to disclose who their sources are, because their concern is that you would then just bypass them, go directly to that source and cut out one amount of cost in that supply chain.
To move further down the supply chain and get access to sub-suppliers, it depends on the structure of the relationship. What we've done in some cases is actually give guarantees to our first tier that we won't bypass them if we get access to the second or the third tier, that we'll keep working through them.
Transparency is about two-way communication. It's about trust.
Trust flows out of transparency. It's also a prerequisite. Nobody's going to start revealing themselves, their information about their company if they're afraid it will be used against them.
You need to be able to share with your supplier your reasons for wanting to understand certain parts of their operation. Once you've manage to share with them that information and they understand what you're going to do with that information, once you've had that conversation, it enables them to have the same conversation with their supplier, and so on and so on. So the conversations are consistent and they're happening at every level.
So it's really important as a business that you have open communication channels, that you've been very clear on the standards and the requirements to do business with you, and that they've been communicated down, and that you've engaged with the supply base to make sure they've really understood what you've communicated and they've understood what is important to your business and how to get in touch with you if they've got some issues with compliance.
Openness and transparency isn't just at the retailer level with their first tier supplier. It needs to be happening at every level of the supply chain. So that communication needs to cascade all the way down the supply chain. And equally, the suppliers in part of that supply chain need to have an information flow upwards.
It's about not just being clear what you've communicated in terms of requirements, but it's also about hearing what the challenges are with meeting those requirements.
Without having an open dialogue with the supplier and actually acknowledging that we do expect you to have some problems in your supply chain, we do expect there to be difficulties, that's why we're interacting with you. Without that conversation, that understanding, we won't get anywhere. We'll be running around in circles, we'll be creating a huge industry of audits and re-audits.
So what ETI and many others are calling for is opening up a level of transparency around where you're supplying from, who you're actually supplying from, often in partnership. There are different people sourcing from the same factory. What are the common issues that you need to tackle? Pre-competitive issues, issues that are not commercial. And there's a real need for that as we start to want to tackle some of the underlying causes of issues rather than just look at the symptoms.
To end, I'd just like to leave you with some key questions to think about. The first question is, do you know who your suppliers are? And is that down to multiple tiers? And does your responsible sourcing programme give you the information that you need to understand your suppliers? The second question is, are you monitoring risks? What kind of data do you need to monitor the risks or the potential risks within your supply chain? And is that live data, is it a one-off snapshot? The third question is are you building trust and transparency with your suppliers? Transparency isn't just about knowing who's in your supply chain, it's about getting and giving honest answers. So are you creating an environment with your suppliers that generates and rewards honesty? And the final question is, are you tackling the root causes? So when issues are identified, then they need to be addressed in a way that prevents them occurring again. So what is it that you need to enable that? So in summary, we're moving from, and I love this jargon, from a comply or die to a know and show environment. And suppliers need to be empowered to take ownership of the process. This is something that you need to do with your suppliers, not to them. And collaboration is key. From a Sedex perspective, it's about working vertically with your suppliers, but also enabling an environment where you can collaborate horizontally across supply chains in a way that can drive collaboration, drive convergence in approaches, and reduce duplication.